They called themselves the chosen of the gods, instruments of divine wrath, sculptors of order through annihilation. In the heart of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris whispered to the Euphrates, a people emerged whose destiny was written not in ink, but in blood. The Assyrians rose from the dust of conflict, and they forged an empire so feared that the mere sound of their approach could empty entire cities. Theirs was not merely a kingdom, it was a machine of terror, deliberate, methodical, relentless. In the blazing sun of Assur, the old capital, the first kings taught their sons that mercy was weakness. Conquest was not for glory. It was survival through domination. They learned to wield fear as a weapon sharper than any sword. When a city defied them, its walls did not simply fall. Its people became messages written in flesh. The Assyrians believed that obedience was born only when the memory of resistance had been burned to ash. Imagine the horizon blackened by thousands of soldiers in bronze helmets, the thunder of chariots shaking the ground like an approaching storm. Banners embroidered with winged lions rippled above legions that carried not just weapons, but the wrath of gods. Behind them followed scribes, artisans, and priests, to document, to carve, to immortalize. Every victory was a ritual, every punishment a performance. When the king raised his hand, the fate of entire nations trembled in the balance. And yet, amid the rivers of blood and the smoke of shattered walls, something far more terrifying took root. An idea. The idea that terror could be organized, managed, perfected, that fear could be engineered into policy. In that revelation, the Assyrians became not merely conquerors, but architects of psychological warfare millennia ahead of their time. They ruled not just through armies, but through legend. And legends never sleep. As the fires of their empire spread across the ancient Near East, the world began to whisper a single truth. Resistance against Assyria was not an act of courage, it was a sentence of death. So tell me, if you lived in that time, would you fight or kneel? If this dark journey into the birth of terror fascinates you, leave a comment with your thoughts, hit the like button and subscribe, because what comes next will make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient power. At the heart of Assyria's power stood not its temples, nor its gods, but its armies, forged in the fire of necessity and sharpened by centuries of conquest. From the towering gates of Nineveh, the great capital that glimmered like a jewel of cruelty, the Assyrian war machine emerged, precise, organized, and merciless. It was not chaos that fueled their victories, but discipline. Every soldier, every chariot, every siege tower moved as if part of one vast, breathing creature of iron and rage. Their kings, from Ashurnasirpal to Tiglath-Pileser and Sennacherib, understood that fear alone was not enough. It had to be mechanized. The Assyrian army became the first true instrument of total war. They trained in formations that shattered enemy lines, perfected the art of logistics, moving tens of thousands across mountains and deserts, and turned siege warfare into a science. Walls that had stood for centuries fell not to gods, but to calculation. They built battering rams with iron tips, wheeled towers that loomed like mobile fortresses, and catapults that hurled both stones and flaming pitch. Each campaign refined the machinery of death, but beyond their weaponry lay the essence of their genius, intelligence and fear. Scouts rode ahead, mapping routes, counting wells, noting the weaknesses of enemy fortresses. Their scribes recorded every detail, so that no mistake would be repeated. And when the armies finally encircled a city, they did not simply attack, they performed. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, the ground quaked with rhythmic steps. It was theater, carefully, choreographed to crush morale long before the first arrow flew. Inside Nineveh, the war effort pulsed day and night. Blacksmiths hammered bronze until sparks lit the darkness like fireflies of doom. Artisans carved reliefs of battles not yet fought, as if prophecy itself obeyed the king's will. Even the priests played their part, sanctifying the soldiers with rituals drenched in smoke and blood. The god Ashur watched from above, and his favor, they believed, depended on the number of skulls stacked beneath his gaze. To the Assyrians, war was not merely conquest, it was purification. Each campaign cleansed the world of rebellion, each victory reaffirmed divine order. Their empire expanded like a spreading wound, and every triumph was carved into stone to ensure no one could forget. Cities that resisted became examples, their ruins a warning to others who might dream of defiance. When the armies of Nineveh moved, they carried with them more than weapons. They carried the memory of what had been done to those who dared to resist. The empire's strength lay not just in its numbers, but in the terror that preceded it, terror that arrived long before the soldiers did. The Assyrian war machine was not built to win battles. It was built to erase enemies. Before the first spear was lifted, the battle was already half won. The Assyrians understood something that most empires would only discover centuries later, that terror, when properly crafted, could conquer more cities than steel. To them, fear was not an accident of war, it was the very foundation of victory. When their armies approached, messengers rode ahead like shadows carrying doom. They delivered ultimatums written not in polite words but in threats of annihilation. Cities that hesitated received a second message, the sight of refugees, mutilated survivors from towns that had resisted. These broken bodies spoke louder than any envoy. The Assyrians never needed to lie. Their reputation told the truth. To resist was to invite extinction. To submit was to live, but only barely. The ritual of surrender began long before the gates opened. As the Assyrian army encircled its prey, drums rolled through the air like the heartbeat of approaching death. From the walls, terrified citizens could see prisoners from earlier campaigns, crucified, impaled, or flayed alive, displayed in grotesque symmetry beneath banners of Ashur. It was not madness. It was choreography. The message was clear. This is what happens when gods are defied. When finally the gates creaked open, the ceremony of submission unfolded with chilling precision. The city's leaders were brought before the Assyrian commander, barefoot, robed in ashes, chains rattling at their wrists. They carried tribute, gold, livestock, slaves, whatever could buy mercy. Then came the ritual gesture. They would bow so low that their foreheads touched the dust, acknowledging the Assyrian king as the living arm of the divine. The soldiers watched in silence, eyes like stone. There was no triumph, only obedience. But mercy was never guaranteed. Sometimes even surrender was punished, not to avenge defiance, but to maintain the rhythm of fear. A handful would be executed in public. Their screams became warnings that echoed farther than any army could march. Children were taken as hostages, women enslaved, and artisans deported to rebuild Nineveh's temples. The city might survive, but it would never rise again. Its freedom was gone, its memory rewritten. Through these rituals, the Assyrians crafted something more powerful than conquest: control. They understood that terror was most effective when it lingered, when survivors carried it like an infection to the next city. And so fear became their messenger, riding faster than any soldier, spreading tales of horror that conquered hearts long before armies arrived. By mastering fear, the Assyrians mastered humanity itself. Some cities do not simply fall, they are unremembered. When the Assyrians chose to make an example, they did not settle for victory. They practiced annihilation. Their kings wrote of it with ritual calm, the way a surgeon might describe a procedure. A city would be named, surrounded, broken, and then methodically unstitched from the fabric of the world. Take Lachish, the jewel of Judah, immortalized not by its own chronicles but by its conqueror's pride. Sennacherib had its ruin carved into alabaster reliefs, siege ramps rising like a man-made hill, archers in ranked precision, battering rams striking with clockwork rhythm. Inside the walls, chaos. Outside, a choreography of punishment. When the gates fell, deportations began with bureaucratic efficiency. Not a sack, but a harvest. People measured, sorted, marched away in lines that stretched like rivers of grief. The city remained, technically, but its soul was carried off, brick by brick, in the bodies of its artisans and children. Others fared worse. Samaria's fall shattered the northern kingdom and fed Assyria's machinery of resettlement. Entire populations uprooted and replanted where they would never again grow rebellion. Babylon, proud and unruly, learned that even myth could be humbled. Sennacherib claimed to have drowned its walls, razed temples and scattered its sacred soil into the river. And when Ashurbanipal turned his gaze east, the Elamite capital of Susa was ground under heel. Palaces burned, idols defaced, tombs violated. It was not enough. To defeat a foe, one had to erase his ancestors and future in the same breath. This was terror scaled to policy. After the flames died, Assyrian officials counted survivors the way treasurers count coin. The deportations followed patterns: soldiers to serve elsewhere, craftsmen to fortify Nineveh's glory, priests to strip their gods of voice. The empty streets were not accidents. They were messages. A city that resisted would become a rumor, a warning carried by merchants and fugitives, a phantom on the trade roads whispering, "Do not try what we tried." Even the ruins were curated. Rubble was left where it would be most visible. Heads were mounted where roads converged. The stone reliefs in the palaces did not merely celebrate victory, they prescribed the future. The images taught the next generation how to break a city so completely that rebuilding it would feel like blasphemy. In this way, Assyria turned destruction into a textbook, and then taught the lesson to the world. Archaeologists today walk the scars and read the ash layers like scripture. They find streets sealed by collapsed mud brick, jars left mid-meal, skeletons tangled at thresholds, the moment of unmaking frozen in dust. The Assyrians would have smiled at that. Their goal was always memory management, to decide what would be remembered and who would be allowed to do the remembering. In their calculus of empire, mercy could be an error, annihilation a guarantee. Cities do not rebel when they no longer exist. Tell me in the comments, which fate chilled you most, deportation into oblivion or total erasure? Why? Every empire tells its story, but few dared to tell it in blood. The Assyrians did. They carved their victories into stone, immortalizing pain as art and cruelty as theology. To read their chronicles is to descend into a civilization that celebrated fear as a divine instrument and ensured that no one would ever forget what it had done. The palaces of Nineveh and Kalhu were lined with scenes of conquest so vivid they seemed to breathe. Reliefs stretched for meters, showing soldiers flaying prisoners, heads stacked like offerings, and captives marching in chains. Yet these were not random depictions of savagery. They were propaganda, instruments of control masquerading as art. Each line of cuneiform beneath the images declared divine justice. I destroyed them like a flood. I made their cities into ruins and heaps of corpses. The brutality was ritualized, elevated, sanctified. Assyrian kings understood that terror had to be recorded to have power. Victory forgotten was victory wasted. Scribes, therefore, were as vital to the war effort as generals. They followed campaigns, inscribing clay tablets with lists of captives, tribute, and executions. The tone was never emotional. It was administrative, almost casual. 3,000 killed, 4,000 taken alive. The city burned. Bureaucracy became theology, a god measured in statistics of suffering. Inside these texts lies something unsettling: pride without remorse. When Ashurnasirpal II described impaling rebels outside their city walls, he wrote it as a craftsman notes his materials, precise, cold, instructional. I flayed the nobles as an example. I draped their skins over the city gates. These were not confessions. They were performances of power. To write such acts was to prove them justified, to bind violence into permanence. The chroniclers did not invent horror. They preserved it. But the most haunting element of these inscriptions is their tone of duty. The scribes believed they were preserving divine truth, not human cruelty. In their worldview, the god Ashur demanded obedience, and the king was his earthly executor. To resist the king was to defy heaven itself. Thus, the written word became the empire's most enduring weapon, one that could strike across generations. Stone could not march, but it could remind. Archaeologists uncover these slabs today, their surfaces still sharp, the cuneiform wedges deep and deliberate. To modern eyes, they are evidence of atrocity. To the Assyrians, they were devotion. The palaces were not museums, but temples of dominance, their walls testifying that civilization and savagery could coexist, and perhaps must. And so the chroniclers of barbarity achieved their purpose. The cities they destroyed may have turned to dust, but their words survived the millennia, whispering still. What they documented was not merely history, it was the anatomy of fear itself, carved so that the gods could read it forever. In Assyria, death was never private, it was theater. Every punishment had an audience, every execution a message. The kings of Assyria understood that fear must be seen to be believed, and so they made cruelty into ritual, a sacred act meant to shape the minds of the living. To them, the suffering of enemies was not merely vengeance, it was instruction. When a city defied Assyria, the reckoning began long before the first stone fell. Prisoners were gathered and arranged in the central square. The crowd, terrified citizens, trembling captives, soldiers awaiting command, stood in silence as the royal guards prepared the instruments of pain. The Assyrians had mastered the choreography of horror. Each movement had meaning. Each act carried the weight of divine approval. Flaying was among their favored lessons. The condemned, often kings or generals, were stripped and pinned against the very walls they had once sworn to defend. The executioners worked with the precision of artisans, slicing from shoulders downward, peeling back skin like parchment under the desert sun. Their screams echoed against stone, mingling with the chants of priests invoking Ashur's name. The flayed skins were later draped over gates or hung inside the palace, reminders to all who entered that rebellion was not forgotten or forgiven. Impalement followed, slow and methodical. A sharpened stake, greased with oil, was driven through the victim's body and raised upright so that gravity itself became the executioner. Some lingered for hours, others for days. Along roads and city walls, forests of impaled men marked Assyria's borders, a grotesque geography of obedience. To travelers, these silhouettes in the sun were more persuasive than any army patrol. Decapitation, mutilation, blinding, each form of punishment served a specific purpose. Hands and heads were counted as trophies. Tongues and noses were taken to silence rebellion. The king himself sometimes presided, feasting as the condemned writhed before him. These were not moments of rage. They were rituals of order, affirmations of divine hierarchy. To disobey the Assyrian monarch was to violate the cosmic balance, and the gods demanded spectacle. But the most chilling part was the calm documentation of it all. The scribes carved these acts into stone reliefs, their strokes deliberate and exact. "I flayed many right through my lands," wrote Ashurnasirpal II. "I spread their skins upon the walls of their cities." In the artwork, the victims appear small, fragile, almost peaceful, while the executioners stand serene, as if engaged in an ordinary craft. Violence rendered eternal. For the Assyrians, the display was as important as the act itself. The lesson was meant to outlive the bodies. The sight of flayed skins fluttering in the wind, of impaled forms silhouetted at dusk. These were warnings inscribed in flesh, passed from father to son, generation to generation. They did not need to conquer every city. Some fell simply from the memory of what others had endured. To rule through terror required precision, cruelty without chaos, punishment without remorse. The Assyrians perfected that balance, and in doing so, they discovered a terrible truth: that pain, when made public, becomes power. To rule through blood alone is to exhaust the sword. The Assyrians knew this, and so they learned to rule through theater. Terror was not just a weapon of war, it was a performance of power, carefully staged for maximum effect. Every massacre, every punishment, every conquest was meant to be seen, remembered, retold. The Assyrians did not simply destroy their enemies, they scripted their destruction. The king stood at the center of this dark stage. Draped in embroidered robes and the symbols of divine authority, he appeared not as a man, but as the living embodiment of Ashur's wrath. When the captives were paraded before him bound and broken, the audience was not limited to those present. It included every city yet to be conquered. Word of his deeds traveled faster than his armies. The spectacle was designed to echo. Assyrian generals orchestrated their campaigns like grand ceremonies. Cities were besieged not only for victory, but for demonstration. When walls fell, soldiers did not rush to plunder. They formed ranks, executing prisoners in public view, while scribes recorded the sequence for posterity. The reports carved into stone ensured that terror became tradition. To defy Assyria was not merely rebellion, it was suicide performed before the eyes of gods and men. This political theater extended beyond the battlefield. Inside Nineveh, processions celebrated victories with the trophies of horror, chariots dragging the corpses of kings, prisoners forced to march alongside the severed heads of their kin. The people of Assyria watched in awe and pride, convinced that divine favor rested upon their king. The fear that crushed enemies also united subjects. The same terror that burned foreign cities secured domestic loyalty. It was genius in its cruelty. The Assyrians realized that power is not sustained by the sword alone, but by the story the sword tells. Every empire seeks legitimacy. The Assyrians found theirs in fear. Their rulers turned violence into ritual and propaganda into scripture. They did not just control territory, they controlled imagination. In time, this theater of horror became self-perpetuating. The kings competed with their ancestors not in glory, but in cruelty. Each sought to surpass the last in bloodshed, ensuring that their names would echo louder in the stones of Nineveh's palaces. The audience was the world itself, and the applause came in silence born of submission. Even today, as archaeologists unearth those carved reliefs of mutilation and victory, one can sense the precision of the spectacle. It was never chaos. It was policy. The Assyrians understood that terror, when made public, could last longer than any empire. Fear was their monument. Tell me in the comments, do you think fear still rules empires today? Nineveh was not merely a city, it was a proclamation. Rising from the plains beside the Tigris, its walls stretched for miles, enclosing the very heart of Assyrian power. From a distance, it glittered, ziggurats piercing the sky, gardens lush with imported trees, canals running like veins through its marble skin. But beauty, in Nineveh, was only the surface of a far darker truth. Beneath its gleaming facades, the city was built upon bones. Within its walls stood the palaces of kings who called themselves the lions of the world. The great palace of Ashurbanipal, carved with reliefs depicting wars, executions, and conquests, was a gallery of suffering masquerading as triumph. Visitors would walk past scenes of impalement in burning cities, their steps echoing through halls meant to inspire awe and obedience in equal measure. Each slab of stone whispered the same message: fear is eternal. Nineveh's grandeur was engineered to dominate the senses. Its gates, named after gods and beasts, were wide enough for chariots to ride three abreast. Bronze lions guarded entrances. Colossal statues of winged bulls with human faces stared down at subjects who dared to raise their eyes. Even the air carried the scent of incense and blood, as priests burned offerings in temples that rose beside the royal palaces. The god Ashur, they said, walked these streets unseen, his shadow cast over every act of war. Yet behind this divine magnificence was relentless machinery. The slaves who built the palaces were often the remnants of conquered nations, the last survivors of cities erased from the map. They carved their own people's agony into stone under the eyes of Assyrian overseers. The very art that glorified the empire's cruelty was born from that cruelty. Nineveh's beauty was a monument to submission. Ashurbanipal's famous library, the pride of the empire, was filled with thousands of clay tablets, records of astronomy, medicine, and war. Among them were hymns to victory and detailed reports of massacres. It was knowledge bound to power, wisdom chained to violence. Even education in Nineveh served conquest. To know was to control. To record was to dominate. At night, the city must have glowed like a living flame. Fires flickered in the courtyards, the silhouettes of soldiers and priests danced upon the walls. Music and chanting mingled with the distant cries of captives. It was an empire intoxicated by its own magnificence. A civilization convinced that cruelty was civilization itself, and the citizens, proud of their king's strength, rarely questioned the blood beneath their feet. Nineveh was both miracle and monstrosity, the pinnacle of human ambition and the depth of human terror. Its walls promised eternity, but eternity does not tolerate arrogance. The same fires that once illuminated its glory would one day devour it whole. For now, though, the city still stood, the capital of horror, shimmering like a dream above the graves it had made. Empires built on fear always forget the simplest truth. Terror cannot be owned. It feeds on obedience, but it breeds resentment, festering in silence until it finds a voice. For centuries, Assyria had ruled through violence, and that violence became the rhythm of its survival. But the same hands that carved fear into the world would one day carve its fall. By the time of Ashurbanipal, the empire stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the sands of Egypt. It seemed eternal. Yet within that vastness, cracks spread like veins beneath polished stone. The conquered peoples, Babylonians, Medes, Chaldeans, and countless others, had learned from their oppressors. They had watched the machinery of terror in motion, and now they understood its workings. When revolt came, it came with the cold precision the Assyrians had once perfected. The empire's own policies had sown its undoing. Entire populations had been displaced, mixed, and scattered to weaken rebellion. But this very fragmentation created alliances beyond the empire's control. Old enemies found common cause in vengeance. The aura of invincibility that had shielded Assyria began to fade. Cities that once trembled at its name now whispered in defiance. As Nineveh's power waned, rebellion spread like wildfire. Armies that once marched under the sign of the winged bull now found themselves outnumbered and surrounded. The empire's iron discipline faltered. Loyalty turned to survival. The Assyrian kings, who had ruled through fear, now ruled only the ruins of obedience. When Babylon rose again under Nabopolassar, and the Medes advanced from the north, even the gods seemed to abandon Nineveh. In 612 BCE, the storm finally broke. The invaders surrounded the great city, and for 3 months, Nineveh resisted. The once invincible walls trembled beneath siege towers and battering rams, the same engines of destruction Assyria had invented centuries before. Flames engulfed the palaces where kings had feasted over the screams of their enemies. The murals that glorified conquest melted under fire. The reliefs that told of victory crumbled into dust. The empire of terror was devoured by its own reflection. As the city burned, the Tigris turned black with ash and red with blood. The statues of gods shattered and fell, their stone faces expressionless even as the roofs caved in above them. Witnesses said the roar of the fire sounded like 1,000 voices screaming at once, as if the ghosts of the Assyrians' victims had returned to claim their vengeance. When dawn rose over the ruins, there was no king, no army, no empire, only silence. The people who found the site centuries later could scarcely believe that such a civilization had ever existed. The conquerors had become the conquered, the architects of terror, its final victims. Assyria's end was not merely a fall of walls, but a collapse of philosophy. Fear had built its throne, and fear had torn it down. The world that once bowed before it moved on, but the memory remained, buried beneath centuries of dust, a warning written in ruins. Centuries have passed since the fires of Nineveh were extinguished, yet the air above those ruins still feels heavy, as though the earth itself remembers. Beneath layers of sand and silence lie the traces of a civilization that once commanded the ancient world through terror and awe. The Assyrians believed they were eternal, that fear could carve their names into the bones of history, and in a way, it did. But eternity is not mercy. What they left behind is not glory. It is warning. Archaeologists now sift through their ashes like priests reading the remnants of a cursed scripture. In the broken reliefs, one can still see the gestures of power. Soldiers lifting spears, captives kneeling, kings standing above them like gods. The stones have forgotten their language, but the emotion endures. Each mark cut into alabaster is a frozen scream, an echo of cruelty disguised as civilization. The Assyrians wanted their enemies to remember their might. Instead, the world remembers their madness. The irony is haunting. The empire that sought to erase others from history became itself erased. The fear they built as fortress became tomb. Yet their legacy endures, whispering from museum walls, from clay tablets resurrected in modern light. Their words, calm, methodical, merciless, describe a world both alien and familiar. Because though millennia have passed, humanity still dances with the same shadows. Power still wears the mask of order. Fear still pretends to be peace. Standing among the ruins of Nineveh today, it is impossible not to feel the weight of that echo. The Tigris still flows nearby, indifferent, as it always was. The wind passes through the collapsed gates where once hung the skins of kings. The silence is not absence, and it is judgment. The stones do not speak, but if they could, they would whisper one truth over and over again, that no empire built on fear can last forever. And yet perhaps the most terrifying lesson is that every age forgets. Every civilization believes its own cruelty justified. Every ruler thinks the gods are on his side. The Assyrians were not monsters. They were human. And that perhaps is the darkest revelation of all. If you've followed this journey through the shadows of Assyria, you've seen how fear can build and unmake us an empire. So before you go, leave a comment with this phrase: fear builds empires, but it also destroys them. And if you want to keep exploring the dark corners of ancient history, subscribe and watch the next story. It might change the way you see civilization itself.